We know that one of the biggest causes of injuries is an increase or a steep increase in intensity and or volume uh, that creates a much greater load on the athlete than their previous training has prepared them for. So ideally we want to increase that load progressively over time as opposed to having a sharp spike. So oftentimes at the beginning of preseason, if players haven't been doing anything during their off season, they come in from having a very poor level of conditioning, and now maybe they get thrown right into two-a-days, which is a huge spike, and that's where an injury may happen. What we see also is, a lot of talk in the NBA about the number of injuries that are occurring in the NBA. And as I listened to a podcast that was talking about Aussie rules football, I started to think about the transition of players from, JV to varsity college, college to the NBA. And at each level, you're going to see a spike in terms of the load that's expected of an athlete. So as you go from, middle school to high school, the intensity of the game, the speed of the game, the amount of training, all of these things increase. When you go from high school to college, again, there's going to be a big increase in the number of hours, the speed of the game, the intensity of practice, the intensity of games, and the volume, the total volume of training and practice. And then again, as you go from college to the NBA, there's going to be another steep spike. So all of these transitions present an opportunity for players to get injured. Then the second part of that is these transitions often are happening when the male body is still transitioning. So, you go from middle school to high school, and often that could be around the peak height velocity. 14, 15 years old for an adolescent male, that can be their period of peak height velocity. As you go from high school to college, there's the transition once, because a lot of high school athletes haven't done a lot of, especially basketball players, haven't done a lot of weight training. So now you're transitioning, and you show up for summer workouts, and you go from an athlete that's never lifted weights to one who is starting to lift weights. Maybe getting improved nutrition, or maybe just getting more food because you're living in a dorm situation and you have a buffet essentially, and there's the potential for a large increase in weight, both in terms of adding strength, hypertrophy, muscle, but also just weight from the buffets potentially. And then as players go from maybe they're 1 or 2 years in college to the NBA level, again, you often see players bragging about how much weight they've put on, how much muscle they've added. So and so's added 20 pounds of muscle in the off season, and this is something that young players will often brag about, is how much they've gone from being, let's say, a 6 feet or a 6'8", 200 pounds to being 6'8", 225. In the course of 2 or 3 months, and so you're adding at each of these transitionary periods. Not only are you increasing volume and intensity of the exercise, but you're also increasing the load even more, because you're adding weight onto that athlete. So if the athlete, let's say at the high school level, was 6'8", 180, and so they're going through their training and they're adapting at that weight. And then, they go to college, they put on a little bit of muscle, they eat a little bit more. So now maybe they're finishing their first or second year, going to the NBA draft. And now they're 6'8", maybe 6'9", and they're 195, 200 pounds. So during that period, they've increased their load tremendously, both in terms of the intensity and volume of exercise, but also, putting on 15 to 20 pounds over, potentially a year, maybe 2 years. And so there's not a ton of time to adapt to that new body. Then they make that transition from college to the NBA, and now they're bragging about, going from 195, 200 to 220, 225 over 3 to 4 months, before going into, a much longer season, games with much less rest between them, more intense games, longer games, all of these things that increase the intensity and volume of the exercise, and you're adding additional load from the weight that's been gained in the off season. And this became a topic, with Ben Simmons going down with an injury, and almost the next day after talking about adding 15 to 20 pounds. Whereas somebody like Brandon Ingram has been criticized in some circles for not gaining enough weight before the NBA season. And so one of the things that I thought about as I was listening to them talk about Australian rules football is it would be smart for NBA teams not to have both of those transitions happening at the same time, both the transition from the intensity and volume of college basketball to NBA basketball, and also the transition of an athlete being, say, 195 pounds to 215 or 220. To me, it maybe would be smarter if we transition that athlete to the intensity and volume of the NBA schedule in the first season, maybe try to put on a couple pounds, definitely get stronger, but not necessarily worry about whether or not we can add 15 or 20 pounds, but just worry to make sure that we're getting structurally strong to be able to handle the increased volume and intensity of exercise. And then after we've adapted to that new normal, an 82 game season, back-to-back games, 10-month season essentially, then in the second off season, then we can worry about starting to gain a little bit of weight and getting close to whatever that athlete's optimal weight is going to be, whether that's going to be 215 or 230, or maybe it's going to be 205. So I think there's a real danger in at each of these big transitionary periods where there's a big spike in terms of the intensity and volume of exercise, the expectations for the training, and then we're also making these concerted efforts to add weight onto the body. And so the initial, transition junior high to high school, typically it's the peak height velocity, right around that area, plus or minus a few months. And so increasing the intensity there can have some ill effects just because, the body's growing rapidly, losing some coordination. But then as we go from the high school to the college level, we're trying to add weight and really add muscle size and so forth, at the same time that we're getting this huge spike in intensity and volume of exercise. And then again, as we go from college to NBA, it's the same thing, a huge spike in intensity, volume of exercise, expectations for the training. And then also we're trying to add a lot of size and muscle mass to these athletes. And so typically now you see people blaming the number of games or the length of the season, things of this nature for the problems with the injuries. But I'm going to suggest that maybe part of that is not just, obviously, the volume of games and the lack of rest between games is going to have an effect on injuries. Almost any study is going to support that. But I'm wondering if it's not just the games and the volume, but also this concerted effort to gain weight, whether that's just gaining weight or whether that's gaining, lean muscle. But either way, somebody who weighs 215 is putting more strain on the body than somebody who weighs 195, especially when we're talking about an 82 game season, running 3 to 5 miles per game. That's just adding more and more and more load every single step, every single jump. And so we definitely need to add strength at each of those periods. But I think the concentration on weight sometimes could be contraindicated, and instead, a more gradual progression where we first try to get the athlete to adapt to the new intensity and the new volume and the new expectations of training. And then once we adapt to that and we add some structural strength, then if it's needed, then we can work on trying to add a little bit of weight to one's frame, a little bit more hypertrophy, increasing the muscle mass, and etc., so that we're not doing both at the same time, but we're progressing a little bit more gradually, adapting, first we have to adapt to the game because, the game's going to be there, an 82 game season's going to be there whether you add weight or not. So you can't say, well, I'm going to add the weight first and adapt, and then I'll go play that 82 game season. If that's the goal, then you probably need to stay in college for, 2, 3, 4 years so that you can adapt your body, to a greater size or mass in college and put on and get up to 220, 225 while you're in college. And then you make the transition to the NBA and you're only adapting to, the new game, the new intensity, the new volume. But if players are going, 1 year to college and then to the NBA, like a lot of the ones that do end up adding weight, the Ingrams and Simmons of the world, I would suggest that maybe we want to focus on adding strength or developing strength, increasing strength, structural strength, the ability to tolerate loads first, and then after a season of that adaptation, then start to concentrate on the weight gain.